It was a night that would forever be remembered, not because of what happened, but because of what was said. Words have the power to heal, but they also have the power to wound, to cut deeper than any silence could ever do. That night, between Can and Demet, there was no script, no cameras, no audience. There was only raw truth, unfiltered emotions, and a silence so heavy that even the air seemed to break under its weight. Istanbul was alive, as it always was, with the hum of traffic, the glow of lights, the constant rhythm of a city that never really sleeps. Yet inside that room, time had stopped. Two people who once shared laughter, whispers, promises, now stood on the edge of something fragile, something that could either shatter completely or miraculously hold together with one word. Demet's eyes were wide, shimmering with unshed tears, as she looked at him, waiting, hoping, almost begging for a different response. She wanted him to fight for her, for them, for the love they had once carried so proudly in their hearts. But instead, she heard the words that would echo in her mind for years: "If you leave now, don't ever come back." It wasn't just a warning. It was a line in the sand, a final sentence that sealed a chapter of their story. Can's voice was low, but it carried the weight of finality. He wasn't yelling, he wasn't angry in the way people usually are when they say something they regret. He was calm, almost too calm, as if every syllable had been decided long before the moment arrived. That calmness hurt more than anger ever could. Because anger meant there was still fire, still passion. Calm meant it was over. Demet froze. Her breath caught in her throat, her heart raced, and for a brief second she thought she might collapse under the heaviness of those words. She wanted to scream, to argue, to remind him of everything they had been through together. But she couldn't. Her voice was trapped in her chest, and all she could do was stand there, staring at him, silently falling apart. Outside, the city kept moving, unaware of the heartbreak unfolding inside those four walls. The laughter of strangers echoed faintly through the window, the distant sound of a car horn reminded them that life didn't stop for anyone. But for Can and Demet, everything had stopped in that single instant. Memories came flooding back for her, of their first meeting, the awkward laughter, the long nights on set, the moments when their eyes spoke louder than any dialogue. She remembered the warmth of his hand, the comfort of his embrace, the promises whispered in the dark when no one else could hear. And now, those memories seemed to mock her, reminding her of everything she was about to lose. Can turned away, unable to look into her eyes any longer. Maybe he knew that if he did, he might break. Maybe he was protecting himself, or maybe he was protecting her. But his silence after those words was more painful than the words themselves. Demet felt the sting of rejection, but more than that, she felt the sting of finality. It was as if he had closed a door she could never open again. The room was suffocating, the silence unbearable. She stepped back, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the handle of the door. For a moment, she considered staying. For a moment, she thought maybe if she didn't move, if she didn't breathe, the moment would freeze and everything would go back to how it was. But the weight of his words pushed her forward, forcing her to take that step, forcing her to make a choice. Her heart was screaming, but her body obeyed. She opened the door slowly, every creak of the hinges echoing like thunder in the silence. Can didn't move. He didn't follow her. He didn't call her back. That was the cruelest part. Because deep down, she wanted him to stop her, to take back his words, to tell her that he didn't mean it. But he didn't. He let her go. The night swallowed her whole as she stepped outside. The cool air hit her face, mixing with the hot tears that finally spilled from her eyes. She walked down the empty street, each step heavier than the last, each breath harder to take. And behind her, in that quiet room, Can stood alone, replaying his own words in his head, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. The streetlights flickered above her as Demet walked aimlessly, not knowing where to go, not caring about the direction her feet carried her. All she knew was that she had to keep moving, because if she stopped, the weight of what had just happened would crush her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but she didn't have the strength to look. What if it was him? What if it wasn't? Either answer terrified her. She thought back to the moments they had shared, not just as colleagues, not just as actors playing roles, but as two souls who had found comfort in each other's presence. There had been nights when Can had called her just to hear her voice, when silence between them had felt like the safest place in the world. And now that silence was something else entirely, sharp, cold, and merciless. Demet wiped her tears quickly, ashamed of them even though no one was watching. She hated how vulnerable she felt, how exposed her heart was, how fragile she seemed in that moment. But vulnerability was the cost of loving deeply, and she had loved Can with a depth she hadn't known she was capable of. Her mind screamed at her to turn back, to go back into that room and demand answers, to fight for what they had. But her pride, her dignity, and the sharp echo of his words held her back. Don't ever come back. How could she face him after that? Inside, Can stood frozen. He had expected her to argue, to fight back, to push against his words until he broke and pulled her into his arms again. But she hadn't. She had walked away. And now the silence he thought he wanted felt unbearable. He pressed his hands against the table, his head hanging low, his chest tight with a mix of regret and anger. He wasn't angry at her, he was angry at himself, at his inability to soften, at the pride that had made those words slip from his mouth. He knew he had hurt her, but worse, he knew he had hurt himself too. Because every fiber of his being wanted to chase her, to call her name, to tell her that he hadn't meant it. But he didn't. Something in him refused to move, refused to bend. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was the memory of past disappointments, maybe it was the belief that letting her go was the only way to protect them both from further pain. Yet the truth was, he had never felt more alone than he did in that moment. The walls seemed to close in on him, the silence roared in his ears, and his own heartbeat was the only sound that reminded him he was still alive. Demet, meanwhile, found herself on a bench near the waterfront. The Bosphorus stretched endlessly before her, the lights of the city reflecting on the restless waves. She sat there, hugging her knees, staring blankly at the water as tears streamed down her face. People passed by, some laughing, some talking, all of them strangers to her pain. She envied them, their lightness, their ignorance of how fragile a heart could be. She whispered his name under her breath, as if saying it would bring him back, as if the wind could carry her voice to him. But the only response was the lapping of the water against the shore. Hours passed, and neither of them moved. Can poured himself a drink he didn't touch, staring at the glass as if it held the answers he was too afraid to face. Demet sat on that bench, her phone still buzzing in her pocket, her hands too heavy to reach for it. The night grew colder, but neither of them cared. Their warmth had already left with the words that had been spoken. Deep inside, both of them knew this wasn't just a fight, not just another argument. This was different. This was final. And that thought terrified them both more than they would ever admit. The clock ticked past midnight, and yet the night refused to end. For Can, every second stretched into eternity. He paced the room, replaying the moment over and over again, the echo of his own voice haunting him. If you leave now, don't ever come back. The words sounded crueler each time he heard them in his mind, harsher than he had intended. He had wanted to sound strong, to set boundaries, to protect himself from the pain he feared was coming. But instead, he had built a wall so high that even he could no longer climb it. He leaned against the window, staring at the empty street below. The world outside looked calm, almost peaceful, but inside he was in turmoil. His fists clenched, his chest tight, he whispered to himself, "Why did I say that? Why couldn't I just hold her back?" But pride is a heavy chain, and it bound him to his silence. Meanwhile, across the city, Demet was still by the waterfront, her phone in her hand at last. The screen was filled with messages from friends, from her manager, even from family, but not from him. The absence of his name on her screen cut deeper than anything else. She scrolled through old conversations, rereading words that once made her smile, words that once made her feel safe. "I'll always be here," he had once written. "You and me, no matter what." She let out a bitter laugh, the sound mixing with her tears. "No matter what, she whispered, except for tonight. A couple passed by, holding hands, laughing at some private joke only they understood. Demet watched them, her heart aching with envy. Once upon a time, that had been her and Ken, two people lost in their own world, believing nothing could touch them. But love is fragile, and pride is poisonous. And sometimes, the two collide in ways that leave permanent scars. Hours dragged on. The city grew quieter, the streets emptier, but neither of them found peace. Ken sat down finally, his head in his hands, torn between reaching for his phone and throwing it away. He wanted to hear her voice, to tell her that he hadn't meant it, that his words were born from fear and not from truth. But each time he came close to dialing her number, something inside stopped him. If I call, he thought, what if she doesn't answer? What if she's already decided not to come back? That thought terrified him more than the silence itself. Demet, on the other hand, kept waiting. She told herself she would sit there until her phone lit up with his name. She imagined it, the vibration in her hand, the screen glowing, the relief flooding her chest as she answered and heard him say, "Come back." But the phone stayed silent. And the silence grew louder. By the time dawn began to break, painting the sky in shades of gray and pink, Demet felt numb. She stood up from the bench, her body stiff from the cold, her soul heavy from the night's weight. She walked slowly, each step echoing with the emptiness inside her. Ken watched that same dawn from his window. For the first time in years, the rising sun brought him no comfort. Instead, it felt like an accusation, reminding him that a new day had begun without her, that the choice he had made was final. And yet, deep down, he knew he hadn't truly let her go. He had only pushed her away, hoping she would push back. But she hadn't. And that realization tore him apart. The days that followed were heavy, each one slower than the last. Demet tried to move through her routine, smiling when she had to, answering calls when necessary, but inside she was hollow. Every night when she closed her eyes, she heard his voice again, "If you leave now, don't ever come back." Those words haunted her dreams, turning them into nightmares where she reached for him only to watch him fade away. She wondered if he thought of her too, if his nights were as sleepless as hers, if regret gnawed at him the way it gnawed at her. She wanted to believe that somewhere inside him, he missed her just as much. Can, meanwhile, was drowning in silence. His apartment felt like a prison, each corner echoing with her absence. He caught himself staring at the door, half expecting it to open, half hoping she would defy his words and come back. But the door never moved, and neither did he. Friends noticed the change in him, the way his laughter was forced, the way his eyes seemed distant even in crowded rooms. But Kim brushed them off, burying his pain under layers of pride. One night, alone again, he scrolled through his phone, hovering over her number. His thumb trembled above the call button, his chest heavy with longing. He remembered their last night together before everything fell apart. The way her head fit perfectly on his shoulder, the way she had whispered, "Promise me we'll never lose this." He had promised. And then he had broken it. Tears filled his eyes, but he blinked them away, refusing to let them fall. Demet sat in her own silence, staring at the ceiling, replaying every smile, every fight, every tender touch. She thought about calling him too, but then the memory of his words stopped her. "Don't ever come back." How could she reach out when he had made it clear that her presence was no longer welcome? Yet deep down, both of them were prisoners of the same moment, chained to the same night. Pride kept them apart, but love kept them awake. Weeks turned into months. Life moved forward around them, but they remained stuck in that night. And sometimes, in the quiet hours of dawn, both of them would look out their windows, staring at the same city skyline, wondering if the other was awake, wondering if the other was thinking the same thing. What if I had stayed? What if I had said something different? That night, the night Ken said those words, became the invisible scar they both carried. It was the night that ended one chapter and left another unwritten, the night that reminded them that love is fragile, that words can wound deeper than silence, and that sometimes the hardest battles are not fought with anger but with pride. And though the world would never know the full story, for Can and Demet it was a truth that lived in their hearts forever. A truth that no script, no role, no stage could ever erase. Because behind the fame, behind the cameras, behind the carefully crafted smiles, there was a moment when everything was real. A moment when two hearts broke in silence. A moment when one sentence changed everything. And so the memory of that night lingered, not as a story of love lost, but as a reminder of how dangerous unspoken feelings can be, and how a single phrase can rewrite the ending of a love that was meant to last.